Engaging Frantz Fanon. We have 4 presenters today, and all of them are present, also exciting. And we're just going to go in order. I'm going to give them about 15, they'll probably take 20, but I'm going to give them 15 minutes each, and then we'll try to have some time for questions at the end. So our first presenter is Randall Hogan from Howard University, who will be giving a paper entitled Fanon on Hegel's master-slave dialectic.
Thank you. All right, so the longer title of my paper is "What is the point of Hegel or Fanon's discussion of Hegel's master-slave dialectic?" So the question is, given that this is a section of a smaller section in Black Skin, White Mass, where Fanon talks about Hegel, what point is he trying to make? What's the significance of having a conversation about Hegel at the end of Black Skin, White Mass? So, one of the problems I saw in the literature was that a lot of people assumed that Fanon's aim was to distance himself from Hegel and Hegel's dialectic and show that colonization and the dynamics of colonization were divorced from these things that Hegel was talking about in the phenomenology. So the debate centered around whether colonization was similar to the master-slave dialectic or divorced from. But I think that central assumption is wrong. I don't think Fanon is trying to distance himself from Hegel. I think he's borrowing Hegelian apparatus to make a point about the particular wrong that is colonization. And another thing I found puzzling was that there's very little, even in the larger books about Fanon, very little talk about or discussion about the discussion of Hegel. So it's usually a paragraph or a few paragraphs. Fanon shows that we can reject Hegel. Fanon shows that he and Hegel exist in 2 different universes. So I thought that was problematic as well, because I think there's something important about asking this question: what's the point of Fanon's discussion of Hegel? So, if you look on your handout, I think there's 2 important points we can get from thinking about why this discussion matters. One, I think in understanding Fanon's discussion of Hegel, we can get a clear grasp on his call for violence in The Wretched of the Earth and in other texts. And I think you can also read Fanon as giving a systematic criticism of colonization if you understand his the way he takes Hegel. Because Fanon is just not saying, I don't prefer colonization, I think it's distasteful. He's saying it's a moral wrong. There's something deeply humanly wrong about colonization. And I think you can't get that point unless you understand what he's doing with Hegel. What I'll do briefly is just go over my reconstruction of the main argument in this section titled The Black Man and Hegel, and then give my argument for the claim that Fanon's point is not to reject Hegel, but to adopt a particular Hegelian apparatus. All right, so I think Fanon's adopting this Hegelian notion of freedom that involves 2 elements. One is autonomy, literally giving yourself a law, and the second element is recognition. So we know Kant and Hegel share this thesis that freedom is a matter of autonomy. But Hegel goes further in saying that autonomy requires a certain amount of recognition, right? To set a law for yourself and to follow it yourself, merely by yourself, is going to be incoherent in a certain way. Like Wittgenstein's example of my right hand giving my left hand $5. Like, it doesn't have the social significance of a gift. In the same way that following a law on your own doesn't have the social significance of being autonomous without recognition. So freedom involves these 2 moments of autonomy and recognition. So Fanon's claim in the main part of the text is that blacks aren't autonomous in the sense that they have literally white mass. They aim at the values that aren't of their own making. And whites are trapped in whiteness for Fanon because they don't recognize anyone that's outside or from the outside. So the sense in which both parties are not free in the Hegelian thing. I mean, Fanon obviously focuses on blacks in the Francophone world, but it follows as a logical consequence that whites aren't free either. So the second argument has to do with the mechanisms, the ways in which freedom can come about. So there's a distinction in Hegel between being a mere thing, and Fanon talks about thinghood as well, and being a person, being a human person. And the distinction between being recognized and deserving recognition. So being a human involves being recognized as a human, and being worthy of recognition involves being willing to sacrifice something of your animal self, your biological self, in order to gain recognition. So there's a sense in which, prior to the struggle in the master-slave dialectic, both parties are locked into thinghood. They become persons through this life and death struggle. And Fanon takes over this premise and says, well, it has to be true just across the board. There's a sense in which you can be recognized, but you know you're not deserving of their recognition until you're willing to, or you have, put out some effort to fight your non-recognition, to escape the zone of not-being. And you see this premise 4, Fanon addresses this worry that the social situation, at least in the Francophone world, undermines, disincentivizes these types of struggles for recognition. There's no actual slavery. Fanon says one day, the white man told the black man, "You are free." For freedom was given, but not struggled for. And being in this state in which you're politically free in a certain sense, but not fully free in the sense that you have both internal freedom of autonomy and external freedom of recognition, is something that persons don't aim at if they're politically comfortable. So what Fanon is saying, almost paradoxically, is that political freedom, or this kind of halfway freedom, is a barrier itself to full freedom. That's what I take to be the main argument in the text. So a lot of controversy has centered around this footnote. So Fanon drops this footnote that's very rich and doesn't explain what he means. So Fanon says, well, obviously the white slave in this situation is not like Hegel's slave, because Hegel's master wanted recognition, where the white man doesn't want recognition, he wants to merely work. And Hegel's slave is different from the black slave, because the black slave doesn't look towards the object, it doesn't look towards his work and social liberation, but his only aims to be like his master. So some have claimed that what Fanon is doing is distancing himself from Hegel, showing that Hegel's dialectic is inapplicable. And I think this is just a weird understanding of what it means for the allegory, which the master-slave dialectic is, to be applicable. And so even Hegel doesn't think the master-slave dialectic is applicable in the sense that it describes an actual historical moment. When he talks about slavery in the encyclopedia, and talks about slavery in the philosophy of history, he recognizes that slavery doesn't arise out of some lack of struggle, and that the resolution of slavery doesn't take the form it does in phenomenology. So I think what we should get out of the dialectic, and I think what Fanon is getting out of the dialectic, is the structured normativity. The structured normativity that involves both autonomy and obedience. So the sense in which freedom for Fanon is going to involve two moments. The moment of mastery, where you create your own laws, and the moment of slavery, where you allow someone to bind you by those laws. So obviously, what blacks in the Francophone world are lacking is this moment of mastery, and whites are lacking this moment of slavery. And this, I think, gives us a picture of freedom that we can see unifying a lot of Fanon's texts. So the claim is, well, we can ask about the rest of the earth, why is it the case that violence is necessary? Why not just have a means end understanding of the end of colonization? Well, the answer is the risk that violence implies, the risk to your biological life, is going to be necessary for you to be worthy of being a person. So when Fanon talks about creating new men, I think this is what he's talking about, making an ontological shift between being a mere thing and being a person. And I think you can understand that move, the depth of that move, without understanding the way he takes up Hegel. So I'll stop there.
All right. We'll take questions at the end, which seems to have been the norm for the conference so far, so we'll stick with that. So if you have questions for Dr. Hogan, hang on to them until the end. Next up, we have Alex Welcome from Laguardia Community College. He'll be presenting Narcissism as Disconcern, White Articulations of the White World in the Work of Frantz Fanon.
Okay, so I forgot to tell the young woman operating the camera that I literally cannot sit still, so I have to move back and forth, but I'm going to keep it between here and here. I want to thank everybody for coming here. I literally had questions upon questions for every single panelist that I saw, and I'm actually going to try to respond to some of the things that I heard in my presentation. So I also want to thank Tommy Curry, Randall's not here, for putting this together. And I also, obviously, always want to thank Marissa Gordon and Jane Gordon. He's been, so influential in terms of my work. So,
can you hold the microphone or put it closer to you?
Like this?
Yeah, sure.
All right, so here's a title, and that title was right then. It's not so right now. We're going to talk about the problem. We're going to talk about the problem of race. And one of the things that I always think is that sometimes things are wrong, but they make sense. So our question is, what are the dynamics of racial oppression? Now, in society, when we talk about blackness, when we talk about race, we talk about the Negro as a problem. Now, W.E.B. Du Bois started with this in 1903 when he talks about the souls of black folk, but that's not where he ended. He felt as though this perspective, the Negro as a problem, wasn't the proper way to examine race. So he started there, but then he left. So in 1946, Richard Wright is getting off a plane in Paris, and someone asked him about the Negro problem. And Richard Wright says, there is no Negro problem, there's a white problem. Now, his thinking is such, whites hold power, so if there's a problem of race, we should look towards those people who have power. Now, in terms of studying this problem, I mean, when people study race, we run into all kinds of problems. And so for me, in studying this as someone trained technically as a sociologist, I go to Karl Marx. Karl Marx in 1844, in the Economic and Philosophical Manuscripts, he says that if we want to understand something, we can't start with an imaginary fact. He's criticizing the political economists of his day. He says they start with some imaginary social economic fact, and that's why their analysis is problematic. He says that if you want to understand the dynamics of your day, you got to start with a present day economic fact. So, we go to Frantz Fanon, and we find him doing the same thing. Frantz Fanon at the beginning of Black Skin, White Mass says, concerned with the elimination of a vicious circle has been the only guideline for my efforts. There is a fact. White men consider themselves superior to black men. There is another fact. Black men want to prove to white men at all costs the richest of their thought, equal value of their intellect. So if you're thinking about that 5th chapter of Black Skin, White Mass, it's titled The Fact of Blackness, and a lot of people say, that's a mistranslation. I would say it's wrong because it makes sense. What Fanon was doing, what we should think of Fanon doing, we should think of Fanon carrying out this Marxist type of analysis. He starts with the fact, he tells us that fact at the beginning of Black Mass, and in chapter 5, we see him go over the fact of blackness. So then, we're at this point. What modern day social facts should we start with if we want to understand race? Now, when we're talking about social facts, as someone who is a sociologist, I gotta, push positivity to the side. Because when Durkheim talks about social facts in Suicide and the Division of Labor and Society, he frames facts as things that limit possibility. And that's not what I want to do. And if I'm talking about limiting possibility of inquiry of life, whatever, I got to think about Marxian ideology. Ideology, the dominant ideas, support the dominant class. So as we look for our social fact, we got to avoid ideology. We got to avoid limiting possibility. So yesterday, in many of the panels, there was this question of methodological problems. The keynote speaker talked about philosophy and theory and how the problem there is that you don't find the people. We could talk about ethnography, we could talk about going down and looking at people, but then there's this patriarchal notion of observation. We could talk about the problems of history, who writes it. I remember hearing Tommy talk at CPA about where are the slave narratives. There are always missing things in history. We could talk about quantitative sociology. Darian was in here. If you know, you know. But if you don't, he was in here a couple minutes ago talking about science and its problems in terms of conceptualization and how these hinder our understandings of race. We can talk about novels, but they also have problems. I mean, the thing about a novel is you need time to write one. Suppose you don't have that time. We can talk about music. Music is important, but how representative is it? And so, as we search for our social fact, I think about comedy. Because comedy, if we look at Freud, if we look at Fanon, if we look at Hegel, if we look at Simone de Beauvoir, if we look at Sartre, it's a means of navigating identifying, and sometimes going past ideology. So, our first social fact comes from Kanye West. Hurricane Katrina, August 23rd to September 3rd, 2005, NBC benefit. Kanye is on screen, he's standing next to Mike Myers. If you have a chance to go and look at this, look at Mike Myers, I mean, his body is literally, as Kanye says this, it's a record of white negrophobic anguish. I mean, and you know what Kanye said. Kanye said, George Bush doesn't care about black people. And George Bush said that this was the worst moment of his presidency. We're not going to get into that. But as we go through popular black comedians, and why I pick popular black comedians is because they have jokes that expose ideology, power contradictions, etc., and plus they've been influential. So these comedians that I've named, they've been important during their times and they've influenced later comedians. We have Moms Mabley. She tells a joke about a young woman walking down the street. Some guy comes up to her. He says, don't you have a daughter who's 15? She says, yeah. She says, didn't your husband die 20 years ago? She says, yeah. He asks how you do that. She says, he's dead, I'm not. Richard Pryor talks about an epidemic. Richard Pryor was a drug user and he said, now they're calling it an epidemic. That means it's affecting white people. Maybe next time when something's happening to us, you will care. Eddie Murphy on Reaganomics. Someone yells out in the audience, Reaganomics sucks. Eddie Murphy says, motherfucker, tell me some shit I don't know. Dave Chappelle, in 2000, he says sometimes racism works in a black person's favor. You ever see a black hostage? No, because those terrorists know black lives do not matter. Chris Rock talked about how George Bush gives 0 fucks. Cat Williams says that our government, they're pimps. They get on the news, they act like we ain't even killing over there, killing real people. They don't never get on the news and say, today we killed 4 men, 3 women, and 2 children. They use a word niggas can't readily identify. Today we killed a group of insurgents. Niggas be at the house like, I don't even know no motherfucking insurgents. You can kill all the motherfuckers. I don't have one insurgent friend. I mean, honestly, if I think about it, I don't know insurgents, I don't know refugees, I don't know migrants. I mean, I know people. I know human beings, I know mothers, fathers, children, etc. But what Cat Williams is getting at is that he's talking about how culture and ideology dehumanize people. And as we utilize these concepts that we've been provided with, where are the human beings? And the theory of the sociology, etc., etc. So our second social fact comes from Gunnar Randall. He talks about the American creed. He says Americans are democratic, rational, and we employ a bright fatalism. He says when he's talking about the average white American, so we're democratic, but look at what happens to black people. We're rational, but look at what happens to black people. So how do they balance this democratic, rational aspect with the reality of our racially oppressive world? They employ a bright fatalism. They believe that one day, since we're democratic and rational, things will ultimately get better. So if we're going to understand race, and we're going to start with those facts, my question is, what is the socio-existential act that defines the lived experience of the negrophobe, and what is the goal of this socio-existential act? So in order to figure out what this act is, we can take our facts, but we need a total understanding. Now, some people, when they talk about a total understanding, they talk about bringing the individual and social together. But as we think about Fanon, and as we think about a total understanding, we have to think about possibility. Like Marx, Fanon framed existence in terms of possibility. So we have to ask how the individual, the social, and the possible, and when we're talking about the possible and possibility, we're talking about the possibility of changing oppressive structures come together. Now, Fanon talks about lived experience, he talks about world, body, and time. He talks about world and body in terms of real and quantity. We're not going to go into this, but this is what he says about time. The architecture of this work is rooted in the temporal. Every human problem must be considered from the standpoint of time. Ideally, the present will always contribute to the building of the future, and this future is not the future of the cosmos, but rather the future of my century, my country, my existence. In no fashion shall I undertake to prepare the world that will come later. I belong irreducibly to my time. So we have our facts. The negrophobe, the average white person doesn't care. We're trying to get an understanding of what is the dominant socio-existential act that defines the negrophobe's existence. If you look at Fanon in Black Skin, White Masks, he has this long narrative on motherhood. And it's very important. Basically, what Fanon says is that our care for others is important. He says at one point, at first it may seem strange that the anti-Semite's outlook should be related to that of the Negrophobe, was my philosophy professor, native Antilles, who recalled the fact to me one day, whenever you hear anyone abuse the Jews, pay attention because he is talking about you. And I found that he was universally right, by which I meant that I was answerable in my body and in my heart for what was done to my brother. Later, I realized he meant, quite simply, an anti-Semite is inevitably anti-Negro. George Bush doesn't care about black people. We have Fanon on the anti-Semite in this relationship to him. And the claim that I'm going to make is that we can't care about others if we don't care about ourselves. If we look at Fanon on brotherhood, and this means that, and we can go back to Hegel and the master-slave narrative, that the dominant socio-existential act of the Negrophobe isn't his refusal to care for black people, it's his refusal to care for himself. Now, this opens up a whole host of questions. If we go to Martin Heidegger on time, care is how we exist. Care puts us in time, because the things that we care about determine how we will interact with others. When we interact with others, when we care, possibility opens itself up. So we have this Negrophobe who practices what I will call disconcern. Doesn't care for himself, doesn't care for others, but cares the dominant act of existence. And I would say that Fanon agrees with that. So then the question becomes, what does the Negrophobe care about? And how does the Negrophobe care about this thing, this entity, this whatever, in a way that allows him to not care about himself? So in answering this question, I go back to Marx, and in answering this question, I try to situate myself in this larger existential project. So when I think about race, I think about separation. And when I think about separation, I think about W.E. Du Bois, 1903, 1935. In Souls of Black Folks, he says that there are these walls that surround us all. In Black Reconstruction, he talks about labor unity, but what he's really talking about is the absurdity of the fact that these black and white workers are separated, that they hate each other. I see that as the basic project of race, and as we move forward, we can go to Zora Neale Hurston, 1934, 1937, 1939, Jonas Weingord, Go Tell It on the Mountain, Moses Man of the Mountain. And what she says, especially in Moses Man of the Mountain, is that we have this separation because the privileged other has this terrible notion of power, this notion of absolute power. And then we go to Fanon. When he talks about the separation, he talks about separation via impossibility. It is impossible for a black person to be innocent. And it is impossible for a white person to be guilty. We go forward to Louis Gordon, 1995, when he talks about bad faith and anti-black racism. We see this impossibility manifest through possibility. When I think about Gordon's book, I'm glad he's not here so I can say this comfortably, I think it's page 17 and 18, and he tells that story about the community activist, and then the community activist gets put on the spot, he's become a senator, and they're like, why haven't you done X? And basically the community activist, his response is, well, I could do X. So he uses possibility to flee to impossibility. And I want to extend that tradition. So what I look at is how our socio-existential experiences of time, our lived experiences of time, how they enable the flight, bad faith, this flight into impossibility. So we can compare Marx and Fanon. Marx talks about how important species being is. He says that we're supposed to care about each other. It's the defining thing. But he says we don't because of forced labor. We're alienated from the objects that we produce, and we're alienated in our labor. The only reason we work is because we have to. And because of the forced nature of labor, we're focused on our individual selves instead of, caring about our fellow human men and women. Now, when Fanon talks about not caring, he talks about a different type of alienation. He says that alienation, when he talks about the average white person, he talks about duped and duping white men. They lied and they are lied to. So when Fanon talks about not caring, at the center of this discussion of not caring is bad faith. This not caring leads to Fanonian narcissism. This Fanonian narcissism is, all right, I'm in bad faith, I'm lying to myself, let me not care about my fellow human beings. So then the question becomes, what's at the root of this narcissism? And we kind of already covered it. Fanon says that it is impossible for the white person to be guilty. We have disconcern, we have the average white person's failure to care about himself, meaning he can't care about others. The thing the Negrophobe cares about is innocence. In articulating all of his care around innocence, he does not care for himself. We go back to W.E.B. Du Bois, 1935. All right, you're a white worker, your life sucks. Why aren't you coming together with black workers? Because you care about this whiteness, that racial wage, more than you care about your individual existence. But let's go below that. What does it mean to care about that whiteness? Remember, Du Bois said psychological and economic benefits. At the root of this benefit, the psychological part is that there's this care for innocence. Now, I usually get really, really depressed when I think about this, but one of the things that makes me kind of optimistic, you see it in Fanon, you see it in Louis Gordon's work, and Kalina talks about this too, and Darren's not here again, damn it. You see it in the Black Arts Movement. The key is, how do we get people to care for themselves? And in Fanon, in Gordon, and Kalina talks about this, we need a kind of emotional education. Look, there can be differences in class, and you can give people money, and you can give people education, but if they don't care for themselves, if they don't escape this guilt complex, if they don't focus all their care on innocence, all their other stuff isn't going to do good again. Thank you.
Right, coming up next is Patrick Henderson from Texas A&M University. This paper is titled The Phallus and the Ogre, Fanon, Cleaver, and an Anti-Colonial Theory of White Female Power and Black Male Vulnerability.
So, I just want to set up what I want to try to do with Fanon and Cleaver. I think both Fanon and Cleaver have very similar, what I would call gender theories. I think that they are examples of what I would call anti-colonial gender theories, which is going to be different than, sort of classical feminism or even intersectionality as an approach to thinking about the ways that sex, race, sexuality, gender, all of these things. Oh, your face was in my way. Quite shy.
I thought I was doing you a favor.
Man, Mike's so smart. So, what I think is going on in Fanon and Cleaver is being able to take into account, historically, the power that white women have been able to wield over black men. Feminism cannot account for this because there's this idea of universal male privilege or universal access to patriarchy in some way, especially after black men gained the right to vote in the United States, for example. This is Elizabeth Cady Stanton's argument. And even intersectionality is going to have a hard time talking about this because it seems like, at least the way Kimberly Crenshaw puts it, singularly disadvantaged identities like a black man or a white woman being singularly disadvantaged by either their sex, gender, or their race is going to kind of be a stalemate. Well, one person can be sexist to the other, and the other person can be racist to the other, but that doesn't really seem to capture the history of what actually goes on here. So what I want to do is use Fanon's principle of the zone of non-being, and actually I kind of tried to develop some language to talk about this. For Fanon, there is a strict line, I think, between the zone of being and the zone of non-being. He describes the zone of being as the zone of ontology, so I've described the zone of non-being as the zone of non-tology. And the line between this is the line between these is the dividing line of colonial ontology, as I would call it. And I like to draw on like Maria Lugones, Sylvia Wynter, and Owe Yumi to talk about how gendering does not work the same below that dividing line of colonial ontology. In the zone of non-tology, the non-tological, there is no gendering in the same way as there is for the ontological. You have the human and the non-human. This is a much stronger claim than something like post-colonial theory, which is going to talk about superiors and subalterns. These are actually, it's actually the difference between the human and non-human, which is a much different distinction. So when it comes to thinking about this history of white women's power, at least in the United States, I think we can trace this all the way back to the Virginia tax code during colonial times. So 1643, tax code said, if a plantation owner has an indentured servant who is a white woman, they will be taxed if the white woman is in the field, but not taxed for her if she's in the house. If the plantation owner has an indentured servant that's a black woman, there's a tax on her for wherever she works. So there's an incentive to bring white women into the home, put black women into the field, and then because black men are increasingly not being able to own property and such, you start to get a distinction between the field and the house, the black and the white. And also with this, where black women and black men are supposed to be, and particularly where white women are supposed to be. So tracing this out, you see during the antebellum period, Martin Delaney noting that white women can capture black men claiming they are slaves under the Fugitive Slave Act, which would be a legal power. Lynching was used as a defense of white womanhood during the antebellum period, and even in the 1950s, white men were able to rape black women and then use their white wives as an alibi for why they would never do such a thing. And I think it's possible to argue, or some people might argue, that, well, this is sort of imposed upon white women. But white women actually actively identified with this idea of being like the pure flower of civilization, as Robert F. Williams puts it. Michelle Newman, in White Women's Rights, she talks about this issue and how early feminists actually took up the idea that they were acting not as women, but as white women who could go out and civilize the inferior, darker races. And it's not just an ideological shift that white women have taken up historically, it's also a very material shift in terms of sexual and physical violence. Frederick Douglass tells a story of a mistress killing a young black girl. Thomas Foster, a historian, has documented the rape of black men by white women during slavery. And even in the 20th century, we get things like the WKKK, or instances like Willie McGee, where white women are able to coerce physically, sexually black men, and then when it's revealed, who gets punished? Certainly not the white women. So this history is sort of what I think Fanon and Cleaver can deal with in a much stronger way. For Fanon, and this is just something I want to touch on briefly, in fact, I'm just going to spend more time on Cleaver because I think it's a little bit more overlooked and a little bit more interesting. For Fanon, he moves away from the Freudian model of psychoanalysis, the ontogenic, looking at the development of individuals, towards the sociogenic, how are individuals produced by a social system. And one of the main mechanisms that this happens through is impulsive cultural imposition. And when he looks at black psychologies, he says, okay, well, obviously black men and women are attracted to white people, but why is this? Well, it's not because they're naturally more beautiful or something like this. It's because they're trying to attain a certain type of personhood, and it's not an authentic way to go about it, or it's a redirected desire to be fully recognized as a human. But in white psychology, this is a little different, because in white psychology, the black person appears as a phobogenic object. White people, in their cultural production, have distinguished between the things that are acceptable and the things that are not. When they start to feel desires that are unacceptable, they then project through the process of transitivity onto the black body the actual desire that they feel. So a white woman may be attracted to a black man, maybe because she's bought into the myth of his sexual prowess, his large penis, or something like this. Then she says, I'm not supposed to feel this. So then she projects that desire onto the black man. The black man must want me. And now the black man becomes a rapist. And this is the racial allocation of guilt that I think Alex was hinting towards in his talk, is that the black body then becomes the guilty body, not the white body. And there's this, I think, really controversial passage in Fanon, where he says, when a woman lives the fantasy of a rape by a black man as a kind of fulfillment of a personal dream or an intimate wish, accomplishing the phenomenon of turning around upon the subject's own self, it is the woman who rapes herself. And I think there's a really easy way to misinterpret this. What he's not saying is that if, in fact, some man forcibly came upon to a woman and forced himself onto her and raped her physically, literally, that's not what he's saying. He's saying that even consensual sex between a white woman and a black man, the white woman experiences it as a rape fantasy, because this is always the taboo. She's not supposed to be sleeping with a black man. And that is, I think, part of what he's getting at. And like Fanon's Black Skin, White Mask, Cleaver's Soul on Ice attempts to account for the mutilated psychologies of blacks and whites. Only rather than looking at it from the French colonial context, he turns to the domestic colony of blacks in the United States. According to Cleaver's gender cosmology, a primeval mitosis divided the male and female hemispheres of the primeval sphere, in which some unknown forerunner of Homo sapiens had embodied both sexes. Having been alienated from each other, the male and female elements are driven by the primal urge to reunite and achieve supreme identity in the apocalyptic fusion. I think that's fucking. In order to follow through this desire for the unity of the sexes, each sex must take on the proper gender by achieving a unitary sexual image, or a heterosexual identity free from all the mutually exclusive, antagonistic, antipodal elements of homosexuality. All societies project their ideas of males and female gender identities onto the people, and each individual's primeval urge strives to realize those gender norms in order to achieve the apocalyptic fusion. A classless society will project a unitary sexual image, making it possible for a man and a woman to achieve the apocalyptic fusion. But a class society projects a fragmented sexual image. Each class projects a sexual image coinciding with its class function in society, meaning that different people of different classes are gendered differently. Since its class function will differ from that of other classes, its sexual image will differ and in the same proportion. Cleaver thus posits a material basis for his understanding of gender, arguing that men of different classes will be gendered differently and women from different classes will be gendered differently. Capitalist exploitation and class stratification, therefore, impedes the desire for the apocalyptic fusion of properly and fully gendered men and women. However, in this society, you get at least an upper and lower class of men and women. The upper class man is the omnipotent administrator. He's defined fully by the mind, and he's the one that makes decisions in this society. His female counterpart is the what Cleaver calls the ultra feminine, and she doesn't have access to the mind in the same way, but both of them have sort of taken flight from their bodies, as Cleaver puts it. They've rejected the body. On the lower class path, you have the supermasculine menial, who is defined purely by physical beauty and physical strength, by the body, corporeally, and then you have the subfeminine, who is also defined by the body, but lacks the delicacy that is taken to be a characteristic of the feminine. And Cleaver says, now, of course, in a racially homogenous society, people can move back and forth between this because there's no way for anybody to indicate where you're actually supposed to be. But he says, quote, in a society where there exists a racial caste system, where the people at the top are sharply distinguished from those at the bottom by race as well as social image, then the two sets of competing images can come into to be considered mutually exclusive. The gulf between the mind and the body will seem to coincide with the gulf between the two races. At that point, the fear of the biological miscegenation is transposed into the social imaginary, and since the distinction between the two races is found in biology, the social distinction between mind and body is made sacred. So in this view, a class society grounded in a racial caste produces an insurmountable separation between the colonizer and the colonized, and is accompanied by a stratification of genders, meaning that in American society, black men and white men are not gendered the same. They couldn't be gendered the same. In Cleaver's colonial ontology, fracturing of genders produces a spectrum of social and sexual desires that betray the primeval urge for the apocalyptic fusion. The omnipotent administrator will make the ultra-feminine, the white woman, the icon of femininity and worship her, but she will be unable to satisfy his desire to truly feel masculine. The administrator may seek to affirm his manhood through masculine activities. However, the administrator may also develop a desire for bodies of the laboring classes in general, and a homoerotic desire for the supermasculine menial in particular. Whether this desire is carried out politically or sexually, homoerotic control over access to the supermasculine media is produced by the reified caste-based separation of the mind and body. So this means that when white men hire black men, that this is a homoerotic act of control, even though there's no overt sexual activity. Something like white sports owners having a team of black athletes is very homoerotic for Cleveland. Likewise, a homosexual supermasculine menial desires the administrator because he wants to be like the administrator, frail and feminine, but the sovereign of society. And this, I think, comes out a little bit in Cleaver's discussion of James Baldwin, his criticism of James Baldwin. The psychosexual state of the ultra-feminine and the heterosexual supermasculine are also produced by caste stratification. Because the basic motion of the woman of the elite is the flight from her body, the ultra-feminine becomes the ogre of frigidity. Having removed herself so far from her body, her man, the omnipotent administrator, cannot satisfy her sexual desires on account of his lack of bodily masculinity. She thus turns to the supermasculine menial, her psychic bridegroom, who she believes can penetrate into the psychic depths where the treasure of her orgasm is buried. Likewise, the supermasculine menial internalizes the beauty standards of the elites and comes to desire only the ultra-feminine, who exerts a magnetic attraction upon him. Despite the mutual attraction between the supermasculine menial and the ultra-feminine, this relationship is problematic in two ways. First, it is not grounded in a healthy psychological disposition, since each desires the other only for their social status or sexual abilities, or presumed sexual abilities as it may be. And second, it is forbidden by the omnipotent administrator, who enforces the racial caste system and its foundational metaphysical dualism with the force and punishes transgression by execution. Finally, the subfeminine is torn between her desire for the supermasculine menial's powerful body and the omnipotent administrator's sovereign mind. So this would be something like black women trying to choose between a strong black man or a white man that actually has power in society. Choosing the former comes with stratification and shame, while choosing the latter comes with power and alienation. It is only within this gender cosmology that Cleaver's social commentary makes sense. Mostly the rest of his book, I think, Soul on Ice. And this is the last point that I really want to make. It organizes, this cosmology, the basic social relationships by economic and sexual functions. Famously, in the opening pages of the book, Cleaver explains the process of becoming a new man required him to overcome the ogre, the white woman, who he says had its claws buried deep in the core of my being and refused to let go. Because the white woman, the ultra-feminine ogre, imposed on the black man, the supermasculine menial, both politically and aesthetically, Cleaver felt the existential weight of the racial caste system. His desire for a white woman and white women's power over black men were products of the ideology and politics of the white man, the omnipotent administrator. The black men are taught to desire white women but forbidden to have them. Only within such a context could someone like Emmett Till be murdered for allegedly flirting with a white woman. It is only in this context that Cleaver's praise of Muhammad Ali makes sense. Cleaver is critical of black leaders that answer to white people in the name of white interest because they reinforce the mind-body division that grounds the white-black binary. Ali, however, refused to fulfill the psychological needs of whites because he represented both bodily masculinity and mental masculinity, reuniting the masculine gender functions and subverting the colonial caste structure. Finally, Cleaver's understanding of desegregation also reflects a hopefulness based on his analysis of gender. In a chapter titled Convalescence, Cleaver suggests that white support for the civil rights movement and the rise of rock music indicated a shift on the parts of whites. They were attempting to reconnect with their bodies. With the walls of segregation falling, Cleaver seemed hopeful that the wall between the mind and body would fall as well, producing the chance for blacks to properly develop their minds independent of white values. And in this context, Cleaver pleads on behalf of all black men to all black women to forgive their past ignorance and inattentiveness. For the time has come when the black man might get back his mind, cultivate healthy sexual desires, and develop a proper relationship with black women, one that will lead to the apocalyptic fusion. And the ultimate impetus, I think, for all this is Cleaver's claim in the opening passages. He says, if the United States is going to overcome racism, he says, what must be done is that the sickness between the white woman and the black man must be brought out into the open, dealt with, and resolved. I think all of us, the entire nation, will be better off if we bring it all out front. A lot of people's feelings will be hurt, but that's the price that must be paid. So, with that statement, if Cleaver is right that that is what needs to be done, can feminism accomplish it? I do not think it can. Can intersectionality accomplish it? I do not think it can. However, an anti-colonial approach to gender theories that thinks about these in terms of relationality could potentially do it, and I think Fanon and Cleaver gesture toward a direction that at least one direction that anti-colonial gender theory could go.
All right. Next up is Chris Randall from Rutgers University, representing Money Over Everything, the Money Team, and the Eschatological Dilemmas of Black Masculinity.
Thank you. First, before getting started, I'd just like to thank a few people. First, I'd like to thank Gerald Birch, Gerald Baker, and William Jackson, with whom this wouldn't be possible. Also, I'd like to thank some of the leadership at Rutgers University, Nancy Cantor, Dean Sherry Ann Butterfield, Dean Battle Brown, and Dean Sharon Stroy for their ability to, and their constant advocacy of me, and I'm very thankful. The basis of my paper today is sort of a discussion about the ways in which masculinity performs itself through blackness and how blackness and black men sort of have to deal and negotiate with those particular issues. So I'm going to start with a few quotes here. First, it says, "When the fear of death is gone, then nothing can bother you and nobody can stop you." That's 50 Cent. The second one says, "The colonized, underdeveloped man is a political creature in the most global sense of the term." It's Frantz Fanon from the Rest of the Earth. "Responding to the ever-present threat of death has been a prerequisite for being black in America since the black surgery in this country began. As my Aunt Barbara says, we've been at this a while." Given this reality, the questions then arise: what posture, attitudes, or actions should black people adopt to confront this reality? Then arises, what rubrics or methodologies should be utilized to critique and study these behaviors, which are in and of themselves responses? This is especially important when analyzing the lives of black men and boys and their performances of black masculinity. Using as a case study the infamous Money Team 50 Cent and Floyd Mayweather, I will argue that the current way that the performance of black masculinities are studied utilize Eurocentric notions of anthropology, thus are rendered mostly incapable to produce language to adequately describe, understand, and to certainly build a personal connection with what we are seeing. So at this point, let me situate myself in this particular discussion. Okay, this sort of issue is very important to me, as I grew up in the inner city of Baltimore, and I grew up with a politically active parent, and I'm now both parentless and a only child. So if you can imagine sort of the alienation that occurs. I think the primary reason for my infatuation with these ideas and yearning to study these ideas is that there's an alienation that happens to many young black men in the world, right? It is that when you are growing up, right, and if it's true that the prison industrial complex targets black men and excludes them from the community, and they literally go missing in adolescent development of young men and boys, if it is true that we see something that the world itself gives meaning to blackness and black masculinity and forces sort of a movement to negotiate with that, if those things are true, then we have to be able to say that there has to be something uniquely important about how we study those issues and how we react to the things that we see, right? If that alienation is obvious, given the statistical data, for more of that, you can read Michelle Alexander's masterful work on the new Jim Crow and mass incarceration. So that's sort of my reality, is sort of understanding sort of how we should navigate, how we should look at the ways in which black masculinity navigates that alienation. So I'm going to tell a brief story. My best friend Derek Lucas and I, when we would part from each other when we were young, we would give each other a handshake that we created and say to each other, "Be safe out here." However, to quote Jared Sexton in a recent article, Unbearable Blackness, this notion of being safe was in fact not a positive program, meaning that we both knew that our lives and where we had to live them lended us no methods by which we could secure safety. Not safety from illness, not safety from marginalization, and certainly, and most importantly, not safety from physical death. Likewise, like myself, many young black men from my generation and younger, due to the emergence of the prison industrial complex and other direct and systemic acts of violence, i.e. police violence, educational lack, and forced criminality, the black males now forced to learn what and who they are based on external forces heaped upon them, immediate images that are internalized from within and without. I'll start with a quote here from Ronald Jackson. Quote, "Du Bois asks, how does it feel to be a problem? The question I will ask is, how did black bodies become a problem in the first place? The social assignment of black bodies to an underclass is a historical conundrum that has multiple origins, two of which are the institutions of slavery and the mass media. A set of racial projections became concretized in the American landscape via the development of meanings that were eventually fortified in many aspects of American life. In other words, black bodies were ascribed with a set of meanings which helped to perpetuate the scripter's racial ideology. Fanon explains this in Black Skin, White Mask in the chapter, The Fact of Blackness, with these simple words: dirty nigger, or simply, look, a Negro. I came into the world imbued with the will to find a meaning in things. My spirit filled with the desire to attain to the source of the world, and then I found that I was an object in the midst of other objects. So what happens is that the idea of blackness, and particularly of black masculinity, is usually basically filled with what other people see from it, right? And what does the current Eurocentric notion of anthropology do to it, right? So is it body posture? Is it movement? It is cultural production, right? And how do we understand the danger that comes about just by being in the presence of a black man? Like Ronald Judy articulates this as the nigger affect, right? That there is a way in which that the world as a schema reacts to the presence of black masculinity, right? So also, I'd like to pause parenthetically just for a moment and we need to sort of think about the ways in which academic study, right, and black, and the quote black or Africana studies sort of looks at these things. I also quote Tommy Curry here in his article on Derelict Method. It says that rewarded for driving philosophy toward its unrealized ideals of equality, human freedom, and racial harmony, African-American thought is consistently relegated to the status of a sleeping dictionary, where the lessons learned through its melanated corporeality is surrendered to gain audience with their oppressors, both past and present. Right? So, when we're looking at the ways in which black masculinity is performed, right, most of the time we take the dominant notions of sort of ideas of things like humanism or feminism and sort of ascribing certain levels of privilege to individual bodies based on gender specificity, etc. And we use those things and place it on black masculinity as if it's applicable, right? As if and what I think Curry is getting at is sort of we know that black men and boys are typically not educated at the same rate, right? If you look at a lot of the different sociological studies that have been done recently, we know that they are educated, they have less access to education, to things like employment, also are definitely targeted by state violence in very disproportionate ways. However, we still assign notions of privilege, notions of heteronormative notions of the ability to move within and without the world as if those things are accessible to black men in the same way. And that cannot possibly be possible in a world where all of the disproportionate effects that are happening in all the negative, right? And so if those negative things are happening, it sort of structures that. So that sort of structures the discussion of I'm trying to have today, right? So William wrote in his award-winning book $40 Million Slaves: The Rise, Fall, and Redemption of the Black Athlete, states that the legendary pugilist and one of the most polarizing figures of early 20th century sports and popular culture, Jack Johnson, was for many whites, quote, an embodiment of the American nightmare, a bold, independent African-American competing for a job on a level playing field. As one writer observed, with money in his pockets, physical triumph over white men in his heart, he displayed all the gross and overbearing insolence which makes what we call the buck nigger insufferable. So it's saying that there's a notion of masculinity that the white world is comfortable with, right? And black masculinity has been assigned sort of a polar reality, right? So you either have the Barack Obama figure, right, or someone who is an integrationist or someone who is an optimist figure here, and then on the other side, what you have is people who are seen as audacious or who perform things that are outside of respectable notions of gender, right? And so that is sort of the polar of where we are. And so for Rodin, Rodin is trying to get at the way in which the white world understood Jack Johnson, the audacity to speak to white women in public, to openly court them, to out loud describe sexual interactions with white women. All of these different things became a fear of the white world had, right? And it described a lot of the negative images. And so if you look at the life of sort of someone like a figure like a Floyd Mayweather, he comes out of what I call the Johnsonian psyche, right? What that means is I know that you hate me, and I will do everything that you hate, right? I will flaunt my capitalist gain in the middle of a recession, right? I will speak to one of my best friends holding a stack of $100 bills as if it's a cell phone, right? I'll have a mink covering around my toilet. I will buy cars, and I will buy cars because, right? And I'll get them all in the same color and drive them and have them color coordinated based on what city I'm in, right? And I will be unapologetic with all of those things, right? Simply because this is who you say that it are, so I'll just be it, right? And so the question is there anything liberatory about being the nigga that the white world thinks that you are, right? Is there any way in which we as a community of scholars can look at that behavior and say that there is something transformative or transgressive that's in that behavior that we ignore, right? And so what was interesting was that as I was reading into the life of Floyd Mayweather, most of the literature that came up was purely about his recent bouts with domestic violence, right? And sort of how that the violence he's acted on women should be juxtaposed with his undefeated record and his moving within the popular culture, right? But what I thought was missing was that we're talking about a society that wholesale undereducates black men, right? Wholesale doesn't provide most black people with any sort of notion of how to A, resolve conflict, B, how to be a symbol of conflict, right? Because we all live in a post-racial society where we clearly don't want to talk about any of these issues in the first place. So now we're struggling with trying to reconcile what the society is telling us with the reality that people are living with, which harkens back to what Curry was saying, right? Our melanated corporality is surrendered. We know we're living in this thing, right? We know what we're seeing, right? We know that we're being followed in stores, right? We know that these things are happening, yet we have to deny it. Yet, but we expect people to have, even in the midst of those things, right, with somebody who's functionally illiterate, we expect them to have good conflict resolution skills. We expect them to be able to interpersonally act with absolute smooth sailing. We expect all those things to happen, right? Even though we know that wholesale black people have not been given the tools to do that. And so, I'll get to. I'm gonna move quickly. So, also one of the things that I also looked at was the way in which black men's trauma is expressed, right? And only thing that we can see is sort of the notions of patriarchy, right? But we don't respond. There is no sort of mentioning, right, in most canonical literature on gender about the ways in which that trauma should be thought about and how it causes other people to be traumatic toward others, right? And so right now I'm going to cite one of the songs from 50 Cent that I think that was definitely very integral in my wanting to write this paper in the first place. And it's a song off of his album called, and I think the title in and of itself is capturing, right? It's called Before I Self-Destruct, right? The album is called Before I Self-Destruct. Before the world, the life that I am leading and the life that I am having to deal with destroys me from the inside, I have something I'd like to say to you, right? And what does that mean? And so one of the songs on the album is called Then Days Went By. And this song is sort of powerful and speaks to me in some very intimate ways because he's talking about the traumatic things that's happened to him and sort of how he has to deal with those things, right? And so here's some of the lyrics. And it's funny because there's so many subtleties in hip hop that change the way we understand the world and should change the way we relate to it. So here's some of the lyrics. The first thing you hear on this song is a very faint sonic sound that sounds like, that it performatively sounds stereotypically like a white nerd's voice, right? It says, "This is how monsters function," right? This is how monsters function. And he goes into the song where he says, you know, keep fucking with me, you gonna turn me back to boo-boo, have me casing out your crib, trying to pop your fucking noodle. She was 20, I was 12, my nana said she raped me, I just smiled from ear to ear, saying, take me, baby, take me. Since high school, I ain't got no friends, got 2 380s like the Yin Yang twins. And then he goes on to say that, you know, it's cold-blooded, real shit, you got to love it, 38 snub it, and didn't think nothing of it, it's the way of the wolves, it's how they train us to move. Right? It's that you are forced in your society to react to these things, right? You are forced to see the underside, right? And what do? And later on in the song, he goes on to talk about sort of, one, if you hear that, right, he's talking about a level of sexual vulnerability and a sexual act he's really trying to make sense of, right? Right. If you flip genders, if you said that there was a 20-year-old young man and a 12-year-old girl, we would all immediately, the society at large tends to feel like a sense of sadness and pain for that young person, right? But he's saying that, you know, I can't even make sense of that. That level of vulnerability is never encapsulated in the way in which dominant feminist theories think about this, right? When Bell Hooks is writing about, you know, the notions of patriarchy and black men sort of replicating those things and wanting women to replicate those things, none of that really ever mentions these sorts of vulnerabilities, right? The way in which black men's bodies are vulnerable and then what the society reacts to that, right? The other thing says, later on in the song, he says, my Uncle Champ pumped crack, smoked my stash up, right? He said, you know, my grandpa was drunk, my Uncle Rock drunk. I mean, how much you gonna smoke, man? How much you gonna snort? First the VCR went, then the TV went. He stole out of mommy's purse. She thought it was me, kid. I ain't asking for no money, son, because I was out hustling. She looking at me sideways like I'm a thief or something. That hurt me. Come on, son, that wouldn't hurt you. I pistol whipped that nigga till his face was purple. I need anger management. See, I hold on to a grudge. The same way I hold on to that nickel plate snub. The Lord don't have imperfections, baby, so I think I'm perfect the way he made me. Some say I'm cool, some say I'm crazy. Some say I ain't shit, some say I'm amazing. So you come to a place where you are physically assaulting members of your family. And you think that it is justice for an act that is also, that they are also a victim of, right? The way in which the drug trade and the way in which these things were filtered through the Iran-Contra affair, et cetera, in the black communities, right? And none of those things and none of those ways of understanding and none of those sorts of nuances or situations are ever situated or analyzed, right? And as a community of scholars, we are usually forced into having these bourgeois notions and bourgeois explanations of sort of black people, black ideology, and we make these moves toward respectability. I mean, I'm guilty as well, right, in many instances, right? We move toward respectability because we understand we really don't have any analytical tools in European canonical thought to analyze what that means or what those things, how those things are structured, right? And then there's all these residual effects, like the domestic violence of Floyd Mayweather, right? The way in which 50 Cent files for Chapter 11 bankruptcy and then spells the word broke in $100 bills on the ground. Right? What am I really saying to white society? What are the arguments I'm really making? Right? And what are those cultural productions that these vulnerable black men are making? What are they really saying about how they feel about the world? How does this vulnerability happen, right? The reason why this music was so touching to me was that there's a quote in one of 50's writings where he says, everybody asked me how it felt to be shot 9 times if it wasn't going to be a bullet for them. Each of us deal with physical, psycho, and sociological wounds, right? Where we're all dealing with, as particularly people of color, dealing with questions of being victims of the drug trade, or being victims of sexual assault, or being victims of overt state violence, right? Right? Where as I told Dr. Harris earlier, you know, 9 people get shot in the church, and they carry the victim, the perpetrator, the Burger King after they catch him, right? And then the president sings Amazing Grace, and it's all good after that. Right? What do we have in our world that allows us to adequately deal with those things?
All right. I think I'll also stick with the standard modus operandi here of taking a few questions. Let's do maybe 3 to start, and then having a round of answers, and we'll see if we have more time. We did do pretty well on time here, so I'll also try to skip around. So let's do Kimberly and Jasmine, right? And Kate. So, Kimberly.
Okay, I just have 2 questions. My first question is for Patrick. Well, I guess it's more of a comment. I think the claim that Fanon has a gender theory never gets spelled out of the paper. And I think that's not an intuitive or obvious claim to make. And secondly, I don't understand why, if you do want to make that case that he does have a gender theory, why you don't talk about both of the chapters. Where he talks about the black women. This seems like everything he said was pretty one-sided. And then I have a question for Brandon and Alex. So my question, it kind of focuses on what Brandon said. The question is this. What do you think the relationship between Fanon's discussion of Hegel and his move to class analysis at the end of Black Skin, White Mass? And I think this picks up on Alex's paper. So I want to know what you think about the relationship. That's all my questions.
Thank you. Jessica?
So I also have a question for Patrick and a question for Chris. Patrick, I would like to hear you elaborate on the move away from intersectionality in terms of a gender analysis to what you're calling anti-coloniality, and specifically the use of cleaver here, right? And so, for one, the non-male enters the picture in cleaver through the lens of desire, right? She's still treated as an object of desire or a participant in desire. So her sexuality is still dominant there. Whereas intersectionality is much more dynamic with the considerations of the sociopolitical, the sociogenic engagements with gender beyond just woman, right? And internal to Cleaver, structurally, his account is heteronormative, right? The goal is to achieve sexual otherness, and the failures are sexual sameness. Black men and women are too sexually same for heteronormative attraction to occur. And so the achievement is to manipulate the conditions such that we can all achieve the natural heteronormative dynamic that ought to be at work between men and women. And so finally that leads to the question of your conception of anti-coloniality. If desire, sexuality, and heteronormativity are the driving points of social change. And then my question for Chris, yeah, I guess I'm a little worried about the defense that you, or the sort of apology that you make on behalf of Mayweather in terms of trying to, I appreciate the critique of the lack of tools given to Black communities, especially to engage in conflict resolution. But I think that displaces the really important aspect of gender oppression, right? And the fact that he's abusing the fact that she's a woman is not an accident, right? And the fact that she's being abused is not about Mayweather's inability to engage in conflict resolution. She's not an object that he needs to learn to negotiate with, better or worse. And so I would just like to hear more about your appeal to conflict resolution in response to issues of domestic violence.
First of all, I'd like to thank each of you for what you brought to the table, for us to think about different ways and at the same time to be clear with the questions that we have had thus far. That it's complicated, Chris. On the one hand, what you say does make a lot of sense, but on the other hand, if it's not comprehended by the other parties, and I think that's part of what you're saying, that do we move forward if the other person, another Black male isn't reading the same way that you are reading this? But I wanted to say to Alex, could you say a little more about the emotional education? I'm not sure if it sounds a little bit like the anthropologist Degry, D-E-G-R-Y, and she talks about this racism, and she goes to the point of white persons needing to deal with a healing of themselves. And you're emotional. I'm kind of thinking maybe moving in the same direction, which I personally think that she makes a very good case for that. So I can give you that reference
So the question about the relationship between Fanon and Hegel and Fanon's class analysis, I think the class analysis would just be a particular instantiation of the same word. So if you have a class system that's repressive, that's one way in which your autonomy is undermined. And so you think of the full picture of freedom for Hegel, this idea of being at home with the norm that you're bound by. I mean, to the extent that you have a class system, they just assume something like Bonilla Silva's understanding of class and how structure creates racism. But that's going to be alienated in a way that undermines autonomy. So we think the class analysis just goes along with the story. There's a particular form of alienation, a particular form of the undermining of autonomy.
In terms of the relationship between Fanon's analysis of Hegel and Marxist analysis, so when Hegel talks about alienation, he talks about being separated from something essential. When Marx talks about alienation in 1844, he talks about the object that you produce not directly fulfilling your wants and your needs. Furthermore, he talks about how the work that you do is alienating, and sometimes if you do your jobs, maybe even as an academic, you're like, damn, I wish this shit was over. So when we have Marx and Fanon talking, when we have Marx and Hegel talking about alienation, and then we have Fanon talks about alienation in a couple ways. So you see the Hegelian alienation, you see the Marxist alienation, and then he talks about the reasons for the Negrophobe being, I'll say, Fanonian alienation, which is basically bad faith. The Negrophobe is a dupe. But if I wanted to bring that all together, I would say that Fanon talks about possibility, specifically possibility is praxis. So the thing that we're alienated from is time. So when we think about something like being apart, we're talking about white people and black people being separate. And so that goes back to the alienated nature of labor. Du Bois talks about the racial wage. You know, Fanon talks about the same thing, where he talks about South African workers, and he says the South African worker, white worker, is taught to hate the black worker. There can be no love between them. So once again, what we're alienated from is time and possibility. And if you want to take it a little bit further, Fanon has this critique of negativity. He says that man must be a no and a yes. Cannot always have a body that questions, a body that's open, a body that's possible. And so in his critique of negativity, you can read that as a critique of Jean-Paul Sartre, Heidegger, Hegel on time, because when Sartre talks about time, he talks about annihilating the past. And when we annihilate, we take the in itself, the past, and we wrap it in nothingness. I'm sorry, but for a black person, that's not cool. You want me to wrap my past in nothingness? Delitzo's not here. He talked about the ancestors at CPA summer school, which was really cool. Some other people talked about the past. If you're black, you're a woman, you're queer, this whole notion of annihilating the past doesn't work. What we're alienated from is time and possibility, and we need to think of a time that's both yes and no. We say no to things, and we say yes to things.
So I guess, I guess I can try to take like both of your questions in a certain way. The main, or the jumping off point for me in this particular project, and the way that I wanted to think about what's going on at Fanon Cleaver, is Cleaver's claim that the fundamental thing that needs to be described or explained is the relationship between black men and white women. Like that is maybe one of the structural keys to understanding like gendered racism and so on and so forth. Not that those, and you know, those two things are not separate, I think. And so in Fanon, I think he does have a gender theory in a certain way. On the one hand, he'll have an idea about the way that whites will gender black men, for example. And that this is how white men and white women will gender black men. And then he'll obviously say something like, well, black men don't necessarily think of themselves in this way. But this is how they're going to always appear in the white supremacist space of colonial society. And so I think there is a gender theory there. But I like your question, Kimberly, because you made me realize that actually what I think is a little bit more important in Fanon is not so much his theory of gendering as so much it is his explanation of desire. So the production of sexual desire in a colonial space, I think, is more central for Fanon than the gendering. But once again, those things are going to work together. So the only way that you can come up with the negrophobic white man being a repressed homosexual, like that claim, it only makes sense if you think about it in terms of like the black male body being like athletic or sexual prowess or so on and so forth, and the only way that you get this sort of white women's infatuation with black men is through the same thing. Oh, like he's gonna have a big penis, he's gonna unlock my orgasm, so on and so forth. And so I think that there is gendering going on there, but that the theory of sexual desire is actually more central for him because he's doing a type of psychoanalysis. For Cleaver, I think what he is up to is, one, he's writing a manual for young black men, black boys, so they don't end up like him. So that's, I think, his target audience. And I think, and I might have misunderstood just slightly the question, but so for Cleaver, women enter the picture only as an object of desire, whereas intersectionality is going to attribute so much more to them, so much more to women in a particular way. Is that kind of, am I on the right track?
More that Cleaver uses like a proto-Lacanian structure, right? And so his consideration of women or gender is going to be by way of sexuality and desire. And gender analysis is different from sexuality studies, right?
Okay.
Those are two different things. And the structure that you're appealing to can only speak to sexuality. And intersectionality, is a multi-dimensional project. And so is your appeal to Cleaver flexible enough to do more than the Proto-Lacanian work?
Okay, so yeah, I think the distinction, or making clear that there is both a gender theory and a theory of desire going on in Cleaver, and that those things work in coordination just like they might for Fanon, I think. And I think maybe that's one of the convoluted things. Obviously, I didn't get to read what is written. I gave like the briefest synopsis I could. But I think those two things, the gendering theory and the theory of sexual desire, work together in a particular way for Cleaver. Because I think once you get people that are gendered in a certain way, then you get the result is certain types of desires. So it's only in a class society that is also a racialized caste society that you get something like white men being homoerotically attracted to black men. And so that gendering produces a certain type of desire. The reason that I think intersectionality would on undercoming is, one, intersectionality, at least in its earliest iterations, conflated, and I would say unsophisticatedly, gender and sex, because just because a particular body is a particular way doesn't mean it has a particular gender. And this, I think, goes for like all sorts of gender theory, but specifically it comes out a lot in Cleaver and Fanon, that just because a white man and a black man have the same genitalia, they're not going to be gendered the same way in the social apparatus. And that's something that intersectionality doesn't really account for in any particular strong way. The other thing is, with intersectionality, is that it's already assuming bourgeois categories in a certain sense of what people are. And when these just sort of get laid over top of each other to try to figure out what are the different identities and what kind of oppressions they're going to be able to claim, already brings in with it what Oyeyemi would call a biologic. Just by virtue of having a female body, thus you are oppressed. And Oyeyemi says, well, you can't do that because what you're doing is saying, I'm being anti-essentialist and then smuggling in essentialism through the back door. And so I find her critique of that compelling, and so I actually use that as sort of a setup, or I would use that as a part of that setup there. Although I will say that for Cleaver there is a definite, I think, heteronormativity operating in it, which would probably be a limitation of what he's doing. For Fanon, I'm not sure that there's a heteronormativity operating there. He doesn't really say one way or the other whether or not this is good or bad. He doesn't really make a value judgment like Cleaver does.
Yeah, he does.
Fanon?
He does.
Okay. Well, we can talk about it later. I've not seen that.
It's more my response to Cleaver than you.
Right.
No. Cleaver makes a value judgment. Fanon.
No, I know. Fanon does.
That's what I'm saying.
Yeah.
So I think those could work out in that way. And then I do I do, in the written version of what I say about Fanon, mention the chapter on black women being attracted to white men, just in the same way. I think he just sees those chapter 2 and 3 in Black Skin, White Mask as different iterations of the same phenomenon, or at least they would be different iterations of the same phenomenon when you look at it through his overall project of trying to bring together ideas of gendering and sexual desire. So.
Well, it's one of the dimensions,
I don't understand. I don't understand.
right? No, it's fine.
I'm sorry. Can you tell me your name again?
Blanche.
Huh?
Blanche.
Blanche. Yes. Yes, ma'am. So first to your question, Jasmine, it was an interesting one and one that I have struggled with for some time. I wanted to make a distinction here. I think there's a difference between what I would say is sort of an articulation versus an apology, right? For example, right, and this is more of a time issue with basic delivery of the paper, but for example, Floyd Mayweather is 1.5 years, and his father is a professional boxer, right? His maternal uncle, okay, so there's a conflict between his mother and his father. The maternal uncle gets involved, right? Shoots his father in the leg and ends his boxing career, right? As a result of domestic violence, right? The maternal uncle shoots his father in the leg, right? The family then spirals into poverty, go from what looks like, his father's like a competitive professional boxer, right? Coming off a title fight, etc. Right? The family then spirals into being dispersed, right? Mayweather's life then takes a turn that goes in a whole different direction. Starts having to live with grandmother 1 week, right? Mom 1 week, the father another week, right? And so this whole notion of continuity and love and care and concern, these things are now shattered for him, right? And as it is with most children, when there's a conflict between adults, right, the child doesn't really get that access to that information, right? So when you're internalizing a traumatic act, right, and this is just an analysis, right? If you're internalizing a traumatic act, you might associate the victim with being the reason why this happened, right? Had my mother not said anything, right? You know, my mother was a victim of domestic violence. In my mind, I'm like, had my mom not said it, you get what I'm trying to get at?
Absolutely, yeah.
And so it's not me saying that I think that magically somehow you give conflict resolution in the inner city, now domestic violence disappears, right? Or that's just like saying you give job, now drug. No, it's to say that there are all of these institutional things, right? The access to psychic evaluation and mental health care, right? The access to sort of spaces like we have, like academic places where we can think about things in a very critical, analytical way. A lot of these things are not given to certain communities, right? And yet we are shocked when there are pathological behaviors that are exhibited, right? That's the whole point of like the notion of when this is how monsters function, right? People who are locked out of sort of not only the notions of gender or anthropology that we find problematic in European culture, but people who are also on a class level just locked out of getting access to those things, right? And when we know that denial of access has occurred, then it's like, oh my God, pathology exists. Well, that's obvious. That should be predictable, right? But the way in which we look at these things are never really taken into consideration. So certain forms of social alienation. And yes, it is very complicated. And I would say just one more thing. What I would say, just one more thing. Yes, it is complicated, right? And given certain time constraints, et cetera, et cetera. But one of the things that I would say is that when we are understanding how we read things, we know that each one of us responds to trauma differently, right? One of my mentors gives a great analogy. He says, if I suck the air out of a room, some people are going to walk to the door and make it out. Some people are going to take a few steps and pass out. Some people are going to pass out immediately when they panic. And so trauma sort of affects all of us in different, very nuanced ways, right? And we have to have different ways to explain or to think about the ways in which those nuances and how we experience those things happen.
So I just want to respond to your question.
Hold on.
I just want to respond to your question about emotional education. So when we think about Fanon and we think about emotional deficits and we think about it, how it relates to the nigger folk, I mean, it's a question we always have about white guilt. Everybody talks, oh, whites feel guilty, but then the analysis shuts down. Why do they feel guilty? And then it just goes. It's always exiled to the past. So one of my major points is that we should think when we think about race, we shouldn't think primarily about the negrophobe's relationship to blackness. We should think about the negrophobe's relationship to himself. So for me, one of the most important footnotes in Black Skin, White Mask is when he talks about the psychopathology of comics. Legman, I believe, is 1948. And I like it because Fanon does not treat racist white people like they're dumb. Because what he's saying is, all right, you know what? They know they got the racial wage, but they know that the thing that's oppressing them is the oligarchy. And so if whites understand who is oppressing them, and going back to what Patrick said about projection, there's an understanding. We can have this discussion about unconscious. I know he uses the word, you see it in the English translation, but he's really not talking about unconscious. They know. So white guilt isn't about the treatment of blacks. White guilt primarily is about the fact that there are these people that are oppressing them, this social system that oppresses them, and they want to fight back, and that desire to fight back has been criminalized. So if we want to talk about the education, the emotional education of the negrophobe, the first thing we got to do is be like, look, white people, admit you hate society. Stop saying it's women, stop saying it's immigrants, stop saying it's gays, stop saying it's black people, stop saying it's lesbians. You are worried about how society does not meet your wants and needs, but you want to blame all these other people. So that is the source of the guilt, and that must be the start of the education. Who are you really mad at?
We can take another question, but please bear in mind that we're all hungry. So okay, let's have Amir and Tommy.
Thank you. Thank you.
I think Amir's going to come at me.
All right, so am I. Let's go. This was such a fantastic panel. Thank you all. I really loved all of your papers for various reasons. I do have to apologize, Brandon, I came a little bit late, so if my question, if you address it in your paper, then you can just tell me, all right? But basically, starting with Alex, right? Who's, right, okay. So, you know, you started off by saying that the Negro problem, in some ways, was the wrong way to understand it, right? And I wonder if that's only the case if we can think of the Negro problem as a problem for consciousness, which is frequently foregrounded when we think of double consciousness as the characterization of the Negro problem, when in fact, most of the time when Du Bois is describing the Negro problem, it is not a problem for consciousness. It is about a problem about being placed externally in a history, a time, and a place, which I think that you talked about in other places. And I wonder if that makes a difference for the kinds of ways to write. So you're saying novels are too long, right? Like Construction is 700 pages, right? Right. So, so if maybe that makes a difference for the ways that we think about how we describe these problems, right? So that, and tending more towards perhaps a more narrative context. And I wonder if, and, you know, related to yes, Brandon, I wonder if that also changes the way that we think about the relevance of Hegel in trying to understand it, because the master-slave dialectic is also a question of consciousness. And you know, in the footnote to one of in Black Skin, White Mask, he says, we're not, you know, the white person doesn't want recognition from the black person; he wants simply labor, right? So then, like, there's the presumption is an equality before engagement, which is not even granted. The white person doesn't even think of it as a struggle, right? So then I wonder if that changes also how we think of, right, the relevance of Hegel at all, right? And then also Patrick, question, just a comment for you, which I was struggling with, and I really liked the distinction, that I really liked the argument that you were making. I think it has a lot of strong tools, but there was some ambiguity or confusion that I was having with your gendered terms, which I think also gets to sort of how we think of, so like if the black bodies are not gendered at all, yet we talk about the black male body as super masculine, right? So there's sort of a confusion. Well, is it gendered at all, right? So then, and then also like the sub-woman or the sub-female, right, for the black woman. And then again, there's a confusion of like this. I like that there is indeed a separate, like trying not to conflate gender and sex, but then there's still like, so I wonder if there may be like a re-articulation of these categories, right? These bodies are identified in as a way that only maybe ascribes the more gendered ones, and simply, when we're talking about the ways in which they actually are gendered, and then sort of filtering the gendered language out in the other ones, right? So then Chris, I just like what you're doing, right?
Thank you.
I think it used all your time, then.
Well,
It's gone.
it's minor action questions,
Okay,
real
good.
quick. Okay. Patrick, twofold. How do you think the original title of Soul on Ice would affect your responses and answers? And how does little Jesus actually go to jail? Right? So how does the Book of Lives change that reading? Chris, can you make the distinction between how we think of domestic violence generally in terms of unidirectional violence versus how it actually happens in minority communities in terms of bidirectional violence, and why that makes a difference in Mayweather?
Thank you. All right.
Oh, wait, sorry, can I just add one?
Nope.
All right.
So I'm going to go through this real quick. I don't think, I would never say that, you know, Du Bois is a Marxist, but there are similarities between the two. One of the major similarities is that I don't think he starts with consciousness. He starts with the interactions between people. And when Du Bois is talking about the racial wage, he's talking about its economic and psychological. When he's talking about psychological, like Fanon, he's talking about these cultural aspects. If you're white, slightly better housing, slightly better schools, slightly better parks, slightly better job opportunities. Also, the ways in which the newspapers present you is better. So there's this cultural representation, there's this social representation, and that goes to consciousness. Finally, you're white, you're a worker, you're underpaid, you know it, you get to beat up these black people. So those things, those interactions between people are the start. So I hear what you're saying, but maybe I'm just a sociologist, maybe I'm biased, but I really think that when Du Bois looks at these things, it's like people are doing this together, this is where it comes from.
So, I addressed this in the paper, but I didn't include it explicitly. So yeah, there is a sense in which Fanon is completely right. Blacks are locked into the zone of non-being, since the whites don't even recognize them as even capable of offering recognition. But Hegel has a two-step kind of process towards freedom, right? You have to get out of the zone of not-being to get free. And so when you talk about the beginning of the spirit chapter, you have two subconsciousness, two individuals that are in the zone of not-being. Right? They're not anything for each other. So they get out of the initial zone of not-being through this conflict. So it's an imperative to do something to kind of prove to yourself that you're not a mere thing, and prove to this other person that you're not a mere thing. And the second hurdle was to get over the master-slave relationship. So it seems like Hegel recognizes that, initially, no one recognizes anyone, right? So there's a two-step process. And I think this is something that Derek Darby picks up as well in his book on race and recognition, this idea that if you have the notion that freedom is a two-step process, you first have to get recognized, gives you a moral imperative to get up and do something, versus having a Kantian notion of freedom in which you kind of just show up to the party in human form and you deserve something. So that's why I think that what Fanon is saying is powerful, and I think that's why if we read it as a Hegelian, it gives us something powerful as well.
I think that sorry, yeah, go ahead.
Well, I'm just going to be real quick with that. First, a lot of the sociological evidence that I was doing research on that I didn't get a chance to get to, when you do a lot of the sociological research, and I'm sure Alex probably can speak to this a lot better, when you do a lot of sociological research on intimate partner violence and the way in which it actually operates in black communities of color, particularly poor communities of color, it's usually bi-directional, right? So you see. Particularly, and then when you start complicating it with questions of gender and sexuality in lesbian, gay, bisexual, and trans community, trans relationships, you see that when you start looking at it in terms of what's reported, what's unreported, the numbers become very, very similar in a way that we really are kind of uncomfortable with, right? Because the narrative we have of domestic violence is the violent black dude beating up on his girl, right? But the question what we never look at is sort of the violence toward young boys, right? The violence that are done by black female parents, right? The violence that is done by black female partners to their partners, right? None of that sort of gets pulled out, right? And I think there's also a quote from Mayweather that I didn't get a chance to include in the paper that I thought was important about the way he's analyzed, right? He says, if you're rich, you're a rich nigga. If you're poor, you're a poor nigga. If you're smart, you're a smart nigga. And at the end of the day, they still look at me as a nigga, right? And so the niggerization of blackness sort of doesn't allow for the way in which doesn't allow for the sort of theorization that would be necessary to really humanize sort of the acts, right? And what those impetus for those acts, right? And sort of how the things we see affects the way what we do, right? And I think that sociological evidence kind of points to that in that direction, right? Is that those things aren't reported, right? Black men feel like from a wholesale that if they report intimate partner violence, they'll be marginalized by their own sort of interpersonal communities, right, intercultural communities, right, and B, that law enforcement, etc., the state, as it would be the sovereign notion of the state, apparatuses don't act in the same way, and that's not treated with the same sort of urgency. So that's something that's something sort of important.
In terms of being gendered or non-gendered, the quote that I have from Maria O'Jones, she suggests that the colonized people are not gendered. I think Cleaver and Fanon say that they are, but it's just different than the colonizers. I go with the latter approach. So I like Laguardia because she helps set up that distinction, the ontological distinction. But I think that there is another gendering process going on that needs to be looked at. So I think that's the clarification there. In terms of Soul on Ice, so the original title of the book being White Woman, Black Man, which was one of the titles of the subsections of the book, like further reiterates the point that like that's like the main site of tension that I think Cleaver is trying to explore in the book, and so he's trying to emphasize that if we can look at this relation, and that's the key. It's the relational part. He's not saying black men are this as a closed-off thing, white men are this, white women are this, black women are this as closed-off things, but that they only make sense, they only can become defined by their interactions, by their relations. That is something that's much different than just, I think, other prevailing theories of gender. And in terms of the story that he tells in his unpublished book, Book of Lies, he tells a story about this other black man in the prison with him that he ultimately has sex with. And for some readings, like Huey Newton's reading of Cleaver is going to be that, well, Cleaver himself is a repressed homosexual. He's sort of he's doing this projection onto others, and then his gay bashing is a way of like him disavowing his own sort of his own homosexual desires in a sense. And that's one way to read that. Another way to read that is that Cleaver thinks of himself as dominating other men, and then that is a false way to get back to some type of unitary sexual image, or to try to maintain some false notion of masculinity. And I don't think that either one of those readings are mutually exclusive. But knowing that about Cleaver, that he's wrestling with this homosexuality in some way, sort of complicates slightly, I think, the picture that we usually get from him as he's misogynistic, homophobic, etc. I think he's a much more psychologically nuanced character than that.
Oh, well, one last thing I would like to say is, I'm sorry, excuse me, I'm gonna defer to that. I'm gonna let that go. What was your question?
You said it's go, right?
Yeah,
we're done.
Please get that question. I would think that was important.
Which question is that?
Yes.
I have it already.
But you can ask the question. Guess what?
You
You
can
can
ask-
still
okay.
talk after the thing.
Talk after.
So let's.
Okay, all right.
Now.